Hello and welcome to Loppy Loves. If you haven't been here before, my name is Lauren and on this channel I talk about my life as an immigrant living in Iceland. In today's Halloween video, I am going to be talking about the lost Icelandic translation of Dracula, Makt Myrkranna, or The Powers of Darkness. How this idea came about was about 3.5 years ago. I saw a post on Facebook and it was like not a meme, it was one of these did you know fact things about Iceland, and usually they are wrong. This one seemed so just outrageous that I thought there's no way this can be true, but I decided to have a look and searched on Google to see if it was true, and it turns out it was. And what this fact was that in 2014 it was discovered that the Icelandic translation of Dracula was actually an entirely different story, and no one had noticed for over a century. This new, I guess, adaptation, because it's not really a translation, seems to actually be a fanfic of the original Dracula novel. And it is very interesting, some of the changes. And it is interesting that no one noticed for so long because the original started being published in 1901. So just a warning before we start, in this video there will be spoilers for the original Dracula story as well as the Icelandic version, but Dracula was published 126 years ago now, so if you don't know the story, I think that's kind of on you. The book has been out for so long, there are many adaptations, there are also film and TV adaptations, and I kind of feel like everyone should know the story of Dracula by now. It is classic literature, so yeah, if you don't already know the story, there will be spoilers in this, but I'm sure you already know it. So first I want to say something about the name. So the name of the book is different from Dracula, it's Makt Myrkranna, or Powers of Darkness. When I got my copy of the book, I said to my Icelandic boyfriend that I had Makt Myrkranna, and he actually didn't know what that translated to because that wouldn't be the way it is said anymore. I asked him how he would say Powers of Darkness today, and he said it would either be Máttu Myrkranna or Kraftu Myrkranna. And I actually went to see The Last Voyage of the Demeter last night at the cinema, which is a film just based on one chapter of the original Dracula book. And I think it was in the last 10 minutes of the film, one of the characters mentioned that we are now surrounded by the powers of darkness. At cinemas in Iceland, the film is in the language that it was released in, and there are subtitles in Icelandic at the bottom. The Icelandic subtitle actually had Makt Myrkranna as the Powers of Darkness translation, so that was quite a nice little Easter egg in the film, and I think that was a great job on behalf of whoever provided the translations for that film. Another interesting side note is that in the original Dracula novel, Iceland is mentioned, but only once. When Dracula is telling Jonathan about his family and who he is descended from, he mentions the Icelandic berserkers. And I was quite surprised when I was reading the original Dracula book to see Iceland mentioned in the book. So I have loved Dracula the story since I was a child, but I realised earlier this year that I had never read the actual full novel. I had read a shorter adaptation when I was a child and knew the story. I studied it in school. I think there was 2 years in a row that we studied Dracula in our drama classes when I was in secondary school. I knew the story pretty well. And earlier this year I went to Whitby in North Yorkshire, which is where Dracula was written, and I finally bought the edition of the book that I've had my eye on for years. This whole novel is not Dracula, this is a collection of Bram Stoker stories, and I actually read Dracula all the way through. I just think this edition is so beautiful, the way it's done. And I was surprised at how well written it was and how it's very suspenseful, and it still holds up as a good piece of literature today. And when I was reading it earlier in the summer, when it came to the bit about the Icelandic berserkers, that kind of triggered the memory in my mind that there was an Icelandic version out there. And I remembered that a few years ago, when I first heard about this Icelandic edition, I had bought what I thought was the Icelandic book here in Iceland, and what turned up was this. This is an audiobook, but it does say Dracula, Makt Myrkranna, and it doesn't say anything about the Icelandic translator, author. It just says by Bram Stoker. I haven't listened to this because I don't really listen to audiobooks in this format. So I actually don't know if this is like a translation, like an actual translation of Dracula, or if it is Makt Myrkranna, which is a different story. So yeah, I will listen to this at some point and work out if this is Makt Myrkranna or the actual story. But when I was reading Dracula, it did get me wondering if there actually was an English translation of the Icelandic translation of Dracula, and it turns out there is. In 2017, Powers of Darkness was published in English, and this whole thing again is not the novel. The novel starts here, which is most of the book still. But the first bit is actually information about the research that went into making this translation and some theories about why it's a different story. So now I am going to go into some of the differences between the two books and some of the changes to the characters, which I found unnecessary and strange. I did use an AI software to create pictures of the characters to put faces to names for this video, with some quite funny results. So first up, we have Jonathan Harker in the original Dracula novel. He was the solicitor who was sent to Castle Dracula to help Dracula as a client purchase a property in London, and he had a horrible experience in the castle, as you can imagine, a castle full of vampires. And in the Icelandic version, his name was changed to Thomas Harker, and I'm not really sure why. Next up, we have Jonathan/Thomas's fiancée, who in the original Dracula book is called Mina Murray, or her full name is Wilhelmina Murray. I am really confused why this name was changed, because Wilhelmina is actually a name in Icelandic. What the name was changed to was Wilma. I asked my boyfriend earlier if Vilma was a name in Icelandic. He doesn't think so. So I don't know why that name was changed. Also, her maiden name is not mentioned in Powers of Darkness. Not that I could find, at least. In Dracula, she does marry Jonathan and becomes Mina Harker. That also happens in Powers of Darkness. In Powers of Darkness, we are introduced to a new character, who is Dracula's niece. Well, we assume niece, but in Icelandic, the word franka means just a female relative. It could be an aunt, it could be a niece, it could be a cousin. It's just assumed in the translation that she is a niece because of the age difference between the two. And she is quite an important character in this book, but she is not actually given a name. So I have decided for the purpose of this video to give her a female Icelandic name that I am sure you all should know. Her name is going to be Björk. Another character who remains unchanged in this video is Van Helsing, and also Dracula himself. The AI created quite an interesting version of Dracula when I typed in Icelandic Dracula. Enjoy. And other important characters in this book, there is Lucy Westenra from the original Dracula novel, and she plays a huge part in the story. And her name has been changed to Lucia Weston. Again, not really sure why. And the other three important characters are Arthur Holmwood, who becomes Lord Godalming. His name is unchanged. John Seward, the Doctor, he's also unchanged. And Quincy Morris. So they all keep their names, somehow. But interestingly, in the Dracula novel, Quincy Morris is just mentioned once to have a lot of money, to be a wealthy man. In chapter 26 of Dracula, Mina notes that Quincy has plenty of money. And in Makt Myrkranna, straight away, he is introduced as a millionaire from America. Another big difference between the books is that Dracula is written as a series of letters, diary entries and telegrams. Powers of Darkness is split into two parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 follows Thomas in Castle Dracula and his experiences there, and that is written from his point of view as diary entries. Part 2, for some reason, switches to the third person and is just like a narrator just saying what happens to all of the characters. And it really changes the feel of the book. Part 1 could be like from the original Dracula because of the way it's written. Part 2 is vastly different and just feels like you're reading an entirely different book. And it's not a nice transition. I'm just going to say part 1 is Jonathan's time in the castle and part 2 is the rest of the story. A Okay, so part 1 in the original Dracula is 22,700 words long. And in the Icelandic version, it is 37,200 words long, which is a 63% increase in that part of the story. It's a lot longer, goes into a lot more detail. However, the second part of the story in the original Dracula is 137,860 words long. And in the Icelandic version, it is 9,100 words long, which is a 93% decrease in length in the second part of the story. All of the detail is in part 1. In Bram Stoker's book, Dracula is confirmed as a vampire. He is witnessed feeding on people. Everyone knows that he's a vampire. And the reason that he moves to England is to gain access to a larger pool of victims because he has kind of depleted the population where he lives. In Valdemar's version of Dracula, the Count is never actually confirmed to be a vampire. He's never seen feeding at all in the book. He seems to want to move to England to gain more cult followers and achieve world domination. Because in this version, Dracula is a cult leader. And this is confirmed when Thomas is wandering around the castle, trying to figure out the layout and trying to work out a way to escape. He accidentally wanders down to the basement and stumbles upon a ritual being conducted by Dracula. He says there are roughly 150 participants there, and he witnesses a young girl being thrown onto the altar, and these creatures are feeding upon this girl and end her life. And a lot of the creatures look like Dracula and portraits that he's seen around the castle, but more mutated ape-like creatures. They don't look human. And this is like a wild take on Dracula, because there is no mention of cult in the original Dracula, and Dracula is not trying to gain a following. It's a really weird take on this. In this version as well, Dracula also has a lot of influence over world leaders. They all appear to be members of his cult. But the person who is confirmed to be a vampire in the Icelandic version is Björk, Dracula's niece. She seduces Thomas. I nearly said Jonathan. She seduces Thomas, much like Dracula's brides in the original Dracula, who are never confirmed to be his brides. They're mentioned as the weird sisters, but we actually don't know their relationship to Dracula. It's just assumed that they were his brides. So Björk, the niece of Dracula, she also seduces Thomas in the way that the brides of Dracula do. And she does attempt to feed upon him until Dracula comes and kind of saves the day. And I think Thomas is quite thankful for Dracula intervening. I think in both books, actually, I feel like Jonathan is also grateful for Dracula for intervening from the three sisters from feeding on him. So let's go into more detail about her, because she is a really interesting character, and I feel like she would have made a great addition to the original Dracula as well. She is young, well, appears to be young, we don't know, she's a vampire, she's probably very old. She's very beautiful. Thomas is very attracted to her, and but always feels kind of a sense of dread around her, and he always wants to see her again, even though he knows that she has a negative effect on him, and he very much loves his fiancée Wilma, and she is always topless for some reason. She's always topless, besides an amulet that hangs down with diamonds and a blood red jewel in the middle, which appears to actually be bleeding sometimes. I am going to read you a small extract from the book, which is Dracula introducing this character and talking about who she is. It's interesting. So Thomas tells Dracula that he's just seen a woman in the room and she just left before Dracula entered. And Dracula says, "What did the girl look like? Was she blonde?" "Yes." "And dressed in pale colours, but in somewhat unusual fashion?" Jonathan nodded. "She had sparkling diamonds on her breast, with a ruby in the centre?" "Yes." "And she must have been, let's say, rather pretty." "Very pretty." "Very pretty, ha ha ha. Ravishing, radiant, like Venus, like Helen of Troy. A wonder of nature, one might say. Have you ever seen a neck like that? Such a bosom, such arms, such lips, not to speak of all the rest. My poor boy, my poor virtuous English man, you have probably never seen a woman like that in your whole life." And after going into great detail about this woman's beauty, he then says, "She's closely related to me, gorgeous as a goddess, but galloping mad." And incest is brought up in the story a bit later on, which shocks Thomas and is a bit shocking to read, honestly. But maybe it wasn't that shocking in Iceland at the time. I am joking, don't get offended. So Dracula says that this woman is crazy because she believes that she is her own great-grandmother, which is a portrait in the family gallery, which Thomas sees later, and it is just a portrait of her. It is exactly the same woman. And when it comes to the themes of incest in the story, Dracula says that most of the men in the Dracula family marry within the family to keep the bloodline pure. However, there have been a few women that married outside of the family because they couldn't find a match inside of the family. Marriages don't really go well outside of the family. So now if we go into part 2 of the book, which is back in England outside of Dracula's castle. So we start in Whitby, which is good because when I'd heard reviews about this story, I'd read in one review that Whitby wasn't mentioned, which I was going to be very mad about. The beginning of the story takes part in Whitby, and we are introduced to Lucy and her 3 suitors, Quincy, John and Arthur. And Wilma, and not Lucy, Lucia, sorry, the names are very confusing. Wilma is going to visit Lucia, very annoying, in Whitby. And Lucia has recently gotten engaged to Arthur after having been proposed to on the same day by John and Quincy as well, just like in the original book. However, in the original book, it goes into great detail about these proposals and how conflicted Lucy felt. In the Icelandic version, it just briefly mentions them, just to introduce the characters, and just Lucia chose Arthur. In the original novel, Lucy starts sleepwalking, and that is the beginning of her illness, and her sleepwalking is considered to be a hereditary trait, and she used to sleepwalk when she was a child. In the Icelandic version, Lucy is introduced straight away as someone who has been sleepwalking all of her life since childhood. It's not new that she's doing it again as an adult, but there is a very interesting reason why she is sleepwalking. So I am just going to read you a little sentence which describes why she was sleepwalking. Lucia was also of a rather frail constitution, as she had unusually sensitive feelings, and ever since she was a child, tended to walk in her sleep, which was blamed on her father being promiscuous. I don't know why. I have asked a few Icelanders since I read that if there was like an old wives' tale that a promiscuous father would make someone sleepwalk. No one has any idea, or at least the people I've spoken to, no one knows anything about why that would be the reason. It doesn't appear to be anything in Icelandic culture that says that, so it's a really weird reason, and it's very confusing actually. If anyone knows why that might be in there, let me know, because I am absolutely baffled by that. Now, in the original Dracula novel, Lucy's sleepwalking and illness is a huge part of the story. It's a big part of the storyline, and I counted the pages in the novel from when Lucy starts sleepwalking. That's not from when she's introduced as a character, from when she starts sleepwalking to her death. That is 67 pages long in my book. In the Icelandic version, I have just counted from when she was introduced as a character, because she was introduced as having always sleptwalked. She dies 13 and a half pages after she's introduced, and in reality it's a lot shorter because the font in this book is a lot bigger. And when I say 13 and a half pages, you can see this is not really a full page. Most of them are not full pages. They're like very short chapters with like half a page of writing missing. So she's killed off very quickly and we don't really get to know her story. And the second part of the book, unfortunately, follows that kind of theme. It's so fast-paced that you don't really know what's going on. And it's not very well written. Like, the first part is very well written, very suspenseful, very intense. In the second part, it's like, this character is introduced, now they're dead. This character is introduced, but they're not really that important like they were in the original book. and it ran so fast-paced that when it came to Dracula's death at the end of the book, I genuinely carried on turning the page thinking it must be like a plot twist and he's going to come back to life. But no, it was just Dracula's dead, end of story. So in the end of the original Dracula book, there is a big chase back to Romania, and Dracula is eventually killed in Romania in some big showdown. That doesn't happen in the Icelandic version. He is killed in his home in London, Carfax, in his coffin. And it is just a very quick, like, they open the coffin, Dracula sits up, Van Helsing stabs him, done. And it was genuinely written, like, that quickly. And after the first part of the story, we have no conclusion for Björk, the female vampire. She's never mentioned again after Thomas leaves the castle. And we don't actually have any kind of conclusion for her. In the original Dracula, the 3 brides are killed by Van Helsing, so their story also ends. This lady vampire, she is never brought up again. So she's probably still in Romania doing her thing. Wandering around the castle, pretending to be her great-grandmother and just, yeah. Now, I am kind of confused what the plot of the story is, or what the story is meant to be about in the Icelandic version. So the original version, I would say that Dracula is not a story about a monster. It is a story about a friendship and how these people join together to defeat this evil in the world. And it's really nice reading like the bonds that form and how close they all become. There isn't that story of friendship in Dracula because the second part is too fast-paced to really establish any kind of friendship between the characters. And I am still confused what the story is meant to be about. The first part is definitely about monsters, but not even Dracula because he's not confirmed to be a vampire, but the Björk, she is a vampire. Dracula is a cult leader set on world domination. Maybe that's meant to be the plot of the story, but that theme doesn't really continue, so I don't really know what the point of the story is supposed to be. Now, the first part of this book is not the story, it's the research that went into making this translation. And there is a theory that Valdemar Ásmundsson didn't actually write this book, that it was indeed Bram Stoker who contributed heavily to writing this book. And the theory is that the prologue at the beginning of the story is signed BS, like Bram Stoker, and that it would have been fraud for Valdemar to have started a story that way with a fake letter. But I think probably Valdemar didn't think he was going to get caught, or just didn't care that much. It's not a stretch for me to believe that Bram Stoker would never have any knowledge of an Icelandic version of this book being made. And another theory is that Bram Stoker was very interested in Iceland, as a lot of his friends were very interested in Iceland. Some of them visited Iceland a few times, some of them taught themselves Icelandic. He was friends with Mark Twain, he was friends with William Morris, and that they were his connection to Iceland and potentially his connection to Valdemar. Even though Bram Stoker himself never went to Iceland, and the theory is that he kind of gave Valdemar permission to publish this version, and it was meant to be based on the original Dracula story, like an original draft that has been lost to time. I don't believe any of this. I think that Valdemar had the story, kind of wanted to improve on it, and was going into a lot of detail, completely changed the direction of the story. And in the second part, it's so rushed because he had to conclude the story. I think that maybe the serialised publication wasn't doing too well, or it had gone on too long and people weren't as interested anymore. So we had to just rush to come to a conclusion, and that's why the second part is so different from the first part. At the beginning of the research section of Powers of Darkness, there is a foreword written by a name that I'm not going to be able to pronounce. I don't know if it's Dak Stoker, who is the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker. And amazingly, he fully supports the theory that Bram Stoker probably contributed a lot to the Icelandic version, and it was probably his ideas. And I, like, reading the research bit, I just can't believe that this would be the case. It seems like there are some loose connections that Bram Stoker might have had to Valdemar. but I don't think the evidence is strong enough to say that Bram definitely wrote this version. Interestingly, in the research section, there are these floor plans of the castle, trying to depict what Castle Dracula would have looked like in this version of the story. I don't think that was really needed. I think they just used it to kind of like bulk out the amount of pages in the book. But I found out there is a website which is powersofdarkness.com, and they actually hired someone to make like proper medieval style floor plans of the castle. That's mentioned in the book. I found that information from the book and went online, and there are these really beautiful medieval style floor plans. I don't understand why they weren't included in the book if they went through the hassle of getting someone to design these for them, and then they just put these not great floor plans in the book and just said go to the website to see the better ones. Another thing to note about this edition, which actually I think this is the only English edition you can get, and I don't think it's in print anymore, but in the research bit, but also in the actual novel section, let's see if I can find some, there are these little, if it focuses, it's probably not going to, there are these little like side notes, yeah, these little bits here, which are like, it explains a little bit of extra information about why the text was translated that way and what the original Icelandic meant, but what the context was meant to be when it was translated into English. If you are a translation nerd, you will really enjoy this edition of the book, I will say that. Yeah, like I said, I think this edition was only printed in 2017, and I think it was only a single run. I did find this secondhand online, and it was quite expensive for a secondhand book because it is fairly rare, I think. I don't know if it has an original price on here. Okay, so the original price that is written in the book is $29.95 US, $37.95 Canadian, or £20 sterling UK. I paid £26 for this second-hand copy, and it was quite hard to find. There was only one copy on the website I looked at, which was World of Books. I'm interested what you think of the cover, because to me, this is like meant to be Dracula with his cape turning into bats. This looks like Batman to me. And with a Dracula book, there are so many beautiful ways that you can decorate it. But I will say that when you take the dust cover off, this edition is much more beautiful. It's not going to focus, is it? Right, you can just about see Powers of Darkness, and it does have the author and everything written. It's in like a shiny foil metallic red on the side. And oh, this bit focuses, I didn't think it would. And there are 3 bats embossed into the front. So this is beautiful as a book. Not a huge fan of the dust cover. When you have like the first English edition of that book, I think you would want to do something good with it, wouldn't you? Like this edition, this obviously this is a collection of stories, but this is like, you know, really, really beautiful metallic foil everywhere, really nice artwork, hardcover book. I'm surprised that they didn't do something like that with this edition. So I hope you liked today's video. It was far more chaotic and disorganised than I was planning it to be, and I'm sorry about that. But the book genuinely is that chaotic and disorganised as well, for the Powers of Darkness book. I would highly recommend that you read it if you are a fan of Dracula. And if you haven't read Dracula before, I would recommend reading Dracula first, then read Powers of Darkness. Read the Powers of Darkness novel section of the book first before you go to the research bit. Like, the research bit is at the front of the book. Read Powers of Darkness first and then come back to the front of the book to read the research bit, because it will make a lot more sense that way. Happy Halloween, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!